Hello? Wow, look at that. Hello, everyone. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Samantha Alger, and I run the Vermont Bee Lab here at the University of Vermont. And I'd like to welcome you all on I think the last day here of National Pollinator Week for our Pollinator Celebration event here at the UVM Hort Forum. This is the first year that we've done this, and this is much bigger than we ever thought this would become. So this was pretty cool. A huge thank you to our event sponsors, of course, the UVM for allowing us this facility, the One Hive Foundation, the Vermont Beekeepers Association, and Caledonia Spirits. Yeah. And we also have a number of organizations that sponsored our raffle today. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the raffle, it is a fundraiser for the Vermont Pollinator Working Group. So check that out. It's at that table right there near the border collie. Judah. All right. So this event was organized by the Vermont Bee Lab and hosted by the Vermont Pollinator Working Group. And we're sort of using this event as an opportunity to share and unveil some of the work that the Vermont Pollinator Working Group has been doing for the past year and a half or so. So a little bit about the Vermont Pollinator Working Group. It was started by myself, Spencer Hardy from Vermont, stand up, Spencer. Spencer Hardy from Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and Laura Johnson from UVM Extension. Thank you, Laura. And it was funded by a UVM Gund APIS award with matching funds from the One Hive Foundation. And the idea for getting this group together is that there are a lot of really awesome organizations and businesses here in the state working on pollinator-related topics. And this was our idea to try to unite and build like a collaboration or a consortium of or coalition, if you will, of these organizations that can all work together, sort of avoid redundancies, figure out how to identify challenges together and work on these issues together. And so we like to think of ourselves as tackling Vermont's most urgent issues that pollinators face here in Vermont. Now, we couldn't just get funded to form a group, of course. We had to come up with a plan. And so we launched with 2 initiatives, which I'll tell you about today. And you're going to learn more about some of those initiatives later on if you're sticking around for the workshop, right? Okay. So the first initiative was has been headed up by Spencer and Laura. And we lovingly call it Know Your 5. And Know Your 5 the idea is that there's more than 350 species of bees here in Vermont, right? That's mind-blowing. And it's really daunting to learn them all. And so this group has been working over the past year and a half to identify and summarize the pollination needs of major crops in Vermont and to better understand the natural history of just 5 bees for each of those crops, which makes it a little bit more manageable for farmers and folks to learn about the native pollinators that are important for crop pollination here. And so they've been going around to farms across the state and giving talks to the public, highlighting these important crop pollinators, 5 of each of these important crops, and they've created a ton of educational materials that are available online about this topic as well. So really cool effort to, in a very manageable way, understand a little bit about the great diversity of our native bees here in the state. So the second initiative I will tell you about was we've been calling the Neonic campaign. And so who here has heard something about neonics recently, like in the past? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I guess it might have been a successful campaign. Speaking to the choir here, right? So it's a research and education campaign targeting Vermont's weak policies on neonicotinoids. And so we pulled together individuals from I just counted them in a spreadsheet last night. There were 14 different organizations that kind of all came together on this across the state, and businesses as well. And the group met about once a month for the past year and a half or so, sometimes more frequently. And we designed experiments around a pesticide monitoring effort that's now turned into this community-wide effort with beekeepers. We shared data. We drafted fact sheets, we provided expert testimony, we gave lectures to the public and other groups. Some of us wrote op-eds, which many of you might have seen. And so we all kind of worked together to kind of come up with a timeline and the release of all of this information, kind of tapping into everybody's expertise. And much of this work informed the work of advocacy groups like, for example, VPIRG, who's here today, that raised support for a new bill, which many of you might have heard of. Who heard of H706? Yeah, some of you. Yeah. Okay. And so this was a bill that was just earlier this week signed into law. Yeah, really amazing. That will now make Vermont the second state in the country to phase out some of the major uses of neonicotinoids, which will in turn offer better protections for all of the pollinators that we're learning about today. So huge thank you to all the folks who worked on that campaign, and here we are today. I'd like to give an opportunity to a beekeeper who has been very vocal about this topic, and Chaz Mraz of Champlain Valley Apiaries. If you want to come up here for a second and say a few words. Chaz and I have been, in one way, shape, or form, been working on this neonic topic for 10 years. I was a grad student when he said, "Will you come and testify at the State House?" And that was 2013, and he picked me up at my house in Burlington, and I drove with him. He testified on a different neonic bill. So this has been something that's been kind of in the works for a decade. So,
thanks. So, yeah, so I know how big and hard this was to pass this bill. It makes perfect sense, this bill, but that doesn't matter in politics. And I've been trying to get something done for a long time, and it's a very difficult task and a huge endeavor. And I really want to thank everyone who was involved in getting that bill through, because it was this is David and Goliath type stuff here. And I think one of the biggest problems I've run into is that people really don't understand bees and the disconnect. And when I talk about bees, I'm talking about all of them. And I look at kind of a big picture, and I told Samantha I'm not going to ramble, so I'm going to try. I really love to ramble. But we're talking about, if we just talk about Apis alone, which is all the bees, they've been around for 80 to 100 million years. Okay, Homo sapien, Homo erectus, before 2 million years. We've come along and we think we're really smart, but I think we're clever, but I don't know how smart we are. We got a long way to go. And we're disrupting something that survived the dinosaurs and ice ages, and just a miraculous ability to survive that we really should learn from them. We should be learning something if we expect to be around much longer. And I would put my money on the Apis if I was going to look out 2 million years and see if Homo or Apis is still going to be on the earth today. So it was, what these chemicals are doing out there is a real environmental disaster. And we've done something about it in Vermont. And I hope after New York and Vermont, I hope this snowballs. And as a board member of the One Hive Foundation, we're going to support these efforts in other states as we go forward, if we can, or the groups that do it. And again, I can't thank everybody enough.
All right, so I'm going to start introducing our speakers. And the way we're going to run the speaker session this morning is we're going to have all the speakers talk, and then at the end of the 3 speaker session, they're all going to come back up here, and then that's when we'll hold our Q&A session. That way they can all be answering questions together. I think it'll feel like a nice little community-style Q&A session. And folks at the tables, you're welcome to come over here. You don't have to stand at the tables right now, unless you want to. Is it still? Yeah, okay. Okay, so our first speaker I will introduce was in many ways the catalyst for our neonate campaign. About, I guess it was 2 years ago, we were sitting around a boardroom, and many of you might have been there. I know Bill Mayers was there, maybe even. I don't know, yeah, maybe we were there. Spencer was there, Laura was there. And we were brainstorming some of the biggest challenges bees face and ideas for how to address those challenges. And Taylor threw an idea up on the whiteboard, which was he wrote a campaign to tackle Vermont's weak policies on neonics. And here we are today. So I kind of credit Taylor's writing that on my board 2 years ago. And here we are. So Taylor is Gund Professor and Director of the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. He has been studying bees and their importance to crops, such as blueberries and coffee, for more than 25 years. He leads field projects in Vermont and Costa Rica and collaborates regularly on national and global assessments of the status of pollinators and their value to our economies and health. Please welcome Dr. Taylor Ricketts.
Hi, everybody. Morning, yeah, thanks. I cannot tell you how thrilling it is to be sitting here in this tent with Vermont Pollinator Working Group kind of banner and the Vermont Bee Lab banner. It just feels like there is an enormous momentum building around pollinators and bees in Vermont. Institutions that 2 years ago did not exist, certainly didn't have banners, are now putting on these events and have like really killer t-shirts to sell and things. But beyond all that are doing really important work. Like I was just listening to Sam talk about what the Vermont Pollinator Working Group's gotten done. Like Know Your Phi was another sort of offhand jotted on the whiteboard thing 2 years ago. And now it's like really out with materials, thanks to Spencer and Laura, materials and information and signs for your farms and things like that. So I just feel like there's this big community or ecosystem of whatever you'd like to call it, growing really rapidly, paying very close attention with a lot of expertise to the fate of our pollinators, and that just feels amazing. So thanks to everybody who's been building this, and it's great to be kind of swept along by it all. It's a great feeling. So so I work at UVM. I direct this thing called the Gund Institute, which is a campus-wide research accelerator on environmental problems in the real world. So trying to get faculty and students to show up for the big problems we're facing planet-wide and help understand them, but also help solve them. And this is clearly one of them. So it's a great thing to be part of. And one thing we have at the Gund Institute is an endowed fund called the APIS Fund, endowed by an anonymous person who's really interested in this kind of thing, that just funds work on the conservation and science around pollinators, both here and nationwide. So, I think we've got a pretty good kind of divvying up of duties among the three speakers. I'm just going to tell you about the bees and their contributions to our food and how that affects you. And then, I won't give your talks, but there'll be stuff about, what we can do to help them and what's threatening them, I guess in the reverse order. But anyway, so I'm heading off, and what I want to do in 15 minutes is just kind of answer these three questions, like who are the bees in Vermont and nationally? What do they do for us, particularly around food, since we're standing at the Hort Farm, and then tell you a story about blueberries, which is a system I know real well, to illustrate those first two things. So that's the plan for my little part of this. Okay, so who are the bees? I want to make a distinction, following up on Chaz, about honeybees and native bees. I think probably the majority of you in this room know this distinction, but it's amazing how few people do kind of on average. So honeybees are this amazing species that does miraculous things as a social insect. They're native not to here, but to Europe and Africa for the most part. They are kind of the workhorse of pollination. If you ask anybody to name a bee, they will say honeybee first. And they, as we've been hearing about, and we are helping to solve, are facing declines and colony death overwintering and diseases for a whole bunch of reasons. So what people often know less about are the native bees. which aren't in, white boxes, are from here, and they are nesting all around us right now, in and around our farms, in and around our houses and yards and campuses and businesses and parks and everything. They also pollinate a lot of crops. They're harder to see, get a little less credit for it, but for some crops, and I'll show you one, they're way more efficient than honeybees on a visit per visit basis in pollinating and actually doing what the plant wants, which is facilitating reproduction, fertilizing seeds, right? So in a lot of ways, they're a great kind of agricultural complement to the honeybees that we all know so well. So I'm going to talk about the second group, the native bees, just to let you know where my focus is. But just acknowledging that there's kind of this difference, but also they have so many interests in common, right? Like neonicotinoids are a huge issue for both. So we don't need to draw this distinction all again and again and again. Habitat, forage, flowers for eating, that kind of thing. Those are all shared interests between honeybees and the native bees. Okay, this was gonna be my pop quiz until Sam ruined it. So, how many people think there are 350 bees in Vermont? A+ for everybody. All right, let's switch to the US. I got a million of these. Let's switch to the US. Let's go to the US. How many people think there are more than 1,000 bees in the US, species of bees? Put your hands up really high. All right, keep them up until you don't agree with what I say. How many people think there are more than 2,500 species of bees? 3,000 species of bees in the US. 3,500 species of bees in the US. 4,000 species of bees in the US. All right, so the answer is 4,000, right? So 4,000 in, the North America. This is all North America. Maybe you would have changed your votes. And about 20,000 globally. So that little picture I showed you of a couple of native bees, those actually represent 20,000 different unique species. So the diversity is just dizzying. Here's a picture of the world's biggest bee and the world's smallest bee in one shot. So in size, they are crazy diverse. In everything else, where they nest, what they eat, how specialized they are, whether they parasitize other bees, whether they actually visit flowers. There's an enormous variety of bees in Vermont, in the US, and globally, right? So in Vermont, as we all now know, there are 350 species. These are photos by Spencer Hardy, who's sitting out in the drizzle. And there's a picture of Spencer Hardy, just to credit the photos of these bees. So it varies from bumblebees to minor bees, Andrena species, to sweat bees, the little jewel-like green bees that are there. So as you're walking around Vermont, the bumblebees are very easy to notice. They're big and fuzzy and loud. They get your attention. Honeybees likewise, but I'd encourage you to look for smaller things. Every time you walk by your garden, any flowers outside a store or anything, just like pause for 10 seconds and look carefully for small things, and you will up your number of species seen into the tens and probably over 20 or 30 if you just do a little bit of that. There are a lot of them out here, and I just would love to have people appreciate that, even today after we stop talking. One of the greatest resources we have in Vermont is also a credit to the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies and Spencer and others, is the Vermont Wild Bee Survey. That's how I know the things I'm telling you right now. It is an amazing effort to sample bees all over the state. We contribute at UVM to that effort every time we sample bees, and we do it all over the place every summer. We contribute those records to this ongoing atlas, and Spencer and the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies are the ones that have been compiling it. If you notice, that's why we know that number. Right? Okay, so this is a free database online. If you ever want to find out what the bee is that you just saw in your garden or outside Lowe's or something, you can go here to help out. Okay, now I want to talk about what bees do for us. So, and I was brief about who the bees are because seeing photos of bees is not as fun as seeing bees themselves. So we brought a collection of some of the common bees in Vermont. So I encourage you, after the talks are done and during the Q&A, maybe we'll pass this around and actually take a look at some of these bees. It's really nicely put together by Leslie Spencer, who I can't see but is here. Yep. Yeah, Leslie. She's a grad student at UVM working on bees all over the state, and there's some nice little blurbs about what you're looking at. Okay. So much for who the bees are. What do they do for us? This is the thing that I've been studying for 25 years, and it's the contribution of bees to our food supply, our food system, our crops. And so here's a honeybee visiting a willow, not a food plant, but anyway, shows what they do, which is transport pollen among flowers and help plants reproduce. Crops are plants. Many of them need pollination in order to do a good job of producing us food, and therefore pollinators are an input to agriculture the same way that fertilizers or water or labor are. So it's an essential input to our food system, and a big one. Pop quiz 2, not scooped by Sam. What percentage of global crops benefit from animal pollination? So there's about 100 of the most important crops in the world that are traded globally. Of those 100, how many benefit from pollination? Ready? Okay, so do you think it is 20% or more? 30% or more? Don't follow me. 40% or more? 50% or more? 60% or more? 70% or more? Hands following, 80% or more? Yeah, it's around 70. You guys have the right intuition, or you've heard this before, one of the two. Right? So let's get specific. Which of the following does not benefit from animal pollination? So these are 4 of the many. Right? Okay, so how many think it's apple that does not benefit? Nice work. How many people think it's cacao that does not benefit? That makes chocolate, right? Okay. How many people think it's pumpkin that does not benefit? Okay. How many people think it's grapefruit? Oh, you're good. It's grapefruit. Yeah, so citrus, it's a little controversial, but mostly not a lot of importance of pollination. Cacao, yeah, has a couple of tiny little thrips that, like tiny little flies that pollinate it. Live in the leaf litter, are required to get any chocolate. Okay, so overall, there's a whole ton of crops, many of them iconic Vermont ones, that benefit either 100% or a little bit from pollinators coming to visit it. Like I said, it's about 70%. It's easily 100 billion per year globally. So it's the same thing. If you took fertilizer away, how much less would we produce? If we took pollinators away, farmers would produce about $100 billion less of food. So blueberries, apples, watermelons, tomatoes, those are all here. This is a great twofer. Both almonds and cacao require pollination, so you get none of it without bees. Even the agave that produces tequila is a bat-pollinated plant in the Southwest. So thank bees for like the variety and tastiness of your diet. You don't need to thank them for the calorie content, because things like rice and wheat and corn, those are all grasses. Grasses are wind pollinated, famously. That's why we sneeze a lot about them. So those do not require pollination. So as a calorie basis, you can't make a huge argument for pollinators. But on a variety and a micronutrient and malnutrition basis, yes, there's a whole bunch of nutrients like folate and vitamin A that for many populations around the world, they receive almost entirely from pollinator-dependent plants like mangoes and squash. So for some, it's a real health issue in terms of nutrition. You can see pollen limitation everywhere. Go to the grocery store today. Check out your strawberries in your fridge. You'll see the evidence of imperfectly pollinated fruit. So all of these are examples of that. If you see like a caved-in apple, that's one of the segments that wasn't well pollinated and didn't release the hormones to ripen the fruit. If you see a wrinkly cucumber, same. If you see raspberries with lots of drupelets not formed, same. In the middle is blueberries. That's what we work on. You get 0 blueberries without pollinators. So they just don't form. So you probably won't see that in the grocery store, but that's what happens when we put a bag around a branch of blueberries. They just don't form. Okay, so a little bit real quick here on blueberries as an illustration of this, right around where we all live. We've been studying blueberries in Vermont for 12 years now, asking the same questions. Who pollinates it? How do farmers get more of those pollinators? And how much value is represented by those pollinators? How much yield do they add to blueberry farmers? So one thing that's really interesting, the first thing we learned, because we were part of this national set of experiments that we're doing identical projects all over the country, is that Vermont has a very unique and cool set of blueberry pollinators. This shows that only 9% of visits to blueberries were honeybees. The rest were all native bees, mostly bumblebees, but a good quarter to a third were all these other ones too. Right, so we have a native pollinated blueberry crop in Vermont. Our colleagues in Michigan, their graph looks like that. Entirely honeybees. And I think that has mostly to do with the intensity with which they grow blueberries, in that their farms don't look like what's around us right now. Lots of diversity, lots of semi-natural places for bees to be. So they have like an intensified industrial pollination syndrome, and we have one that's provided by wild living pollinators. This is a graph I don't want to have you read. I just want to show you that 84 species, I just showed you that 84 species of native bees. Sorry if I didn't say that. But not all of them do the same amount of work. These are the 84, and you can see that we see most of them super rarely. It's really like 5 or 10 that do most of the work. So 84 pollinators of blueberries in Vermont, that's really fun to say, really impressive, but honestly, it's mostly a few that do most of the pollination work, and this is the origin of Know Your 5. If we tell blueberry growers like, hey, you got 84 species of bees to worry about, that's kind of overwhelming, and not really true. So let's find the top 5, the top 10, the top whatever. In our case, there are bumblebees, a few sweat bees, a few mason bees, and a few mining bees. Like a few individuals of each of those make up this kind of fat part. And we know what they need. And so we can be a little more specific about advising farmers. Yeah?
I'm just curious, what are the different photobars?
Yeah, sorry. These are like rough categories that you can spot on the wing, we call it. So it's just like bumblebees, big black bees, green bees. So sometimes we try to sample bees without catching them and not disturbing them, but we can only get to those like kind of toy categories that way. So that, we coded that into that graph. All right, so this was brought up by Sam, but this led to Know Your 5. Know Your 5 is really, really cool. The Vermont Pollinator Working Group just did such a good, fast job of this, and they have fact sheets for a bunch of different crops. Here's the blueberry one, but apples and raspberries and stone fruits and squashes and other things I can't even remember, trying to narrow down the problem to a workable size. So check those out, and I'm sure I think there's a workshop about that later today. That's one of the workshops. So easy. It's like on a platter for you. Okay, the last thing I want to say, and then I'm done, is the economics part. And this is a fun story, but I'll make it short. What we found across all these farms is that some farmers had many, many more bees than other farmers. And we found out why, and we've been advising them as to what correlates to more bees. 10 times more visits on some blueberry farms than others, all within kind of the Champlain Valley. So big variance, and that more bees led to higher yields. So we found the farms that had a lot more bees had up to 12% higher yields in blueberries than farms that had fewer. 11% higher uniformity, which I'm told is like a quality thing. People want uniformly big blueberries, not a big variety of teeny ones and fat ones. And that, when we do all the economics, can add between $1,000 and $100,000 in revenue per farm. So that's the range that I'm talking about, because some farms had so many bees that adding bees wouldn't have added much yield. Others had so few bees that adding bees would add a lot of yield. So it's a lot, and it varies among farms. And working on blueberries has its benefits come harvest time. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Emily to talk about like what bees need and how we can help. Just to editorialize once on that, in the Gund Institute, we work on a lot of very big problems like climate change and food insecurity, things that really are tough to get your head around and tough to see solutions of and get you down a little bit sometimes. That's just what we do. Pollination is not like that. It is really clear what we can do to help pollinators. It's easy to do. You could do it in your house, in your yard, on a farm like this. It's a wonderfully tractable problem among lots and lots of not very tractable problems. So to me, it's really inspiring, kind of motivating to work on something that's actually, we know what to do and it's easy to do it. So thanks.
Thank you, Taylor. Our next speaker, so I met Emily almost 10 years ago because there was a concerned citizen who had hundreds of queen bumblebees digging down into her dirt of her yard in early fall. And it turns out that this person had found a bumblebee queen overwintering site, which is like a really difficult thing to find. There's very little about it in the literature. Like you have to go back to like, I don't know, the 1800s or the early 1900s to read about some of these papers about bumblebee overwintering sites in many cases. So that's, Emily and I shared this really amazing experience together. That was 10 years ago, almost, yeah. All right, so since then I've had the pleasure working alongside Emily in this Vermont Pollinator Working Group. She's been an absolute powerhouse during the NeoKnit campaign. She's drafted educational fact sheets, provided expert testimony, wrote press releases, and she even helped us to collect bumblebees as part of our pesticide monitoring project. So both on the computer and in the field. All right, so Emily is a pollinator conservation biologist and agricultural lead with the Xerces Society Pesticide Program. She received a Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Her work with Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting crop pollinators with habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. So, Emily, please, thank you.
What a turnout. Thank you for being here on a gray day to talk about pollinators. And thanks, Sam, for inviting me to talk. So I'm going to talk about global threats to pollinators. And it's sort of a think globally, act locally talk. Because all of these threats, the multi-crisis that affects pollinators and lots of other kinds of wildlife, is something, like Taylor said, that's tractable, that we can do something about. Many of these things are human actions and behavior that we can work to correct on the local level. If you're not familiar with Xerces, we're a nonprofit organization that was founded originally as a group of butterfly scientists about 50 years ago. We have our main offices in Portland, but we have staff around the country working on habitat restoration, endangered species, and pesticide reduction, which is the team that I'm on. And so it's not just a pollinator issue when it comes to the kind of multi-crisis of biodiversity. For those of us who've been driving for more than a decade or two, if we think back to when we would go out and drive for an hour, we used to see a lot more bugs getting splattered across the front of the car. This is just an anecdote, but it points to something that is real. And I think it's easy, to shift our baseline in what we expect to see around us. So if insects are getting lower and lower and lower in abundance and diversity and biomass over the years, each year we maybe expect to see a little bit lower activity. And it's only when we think back a couple of decades to what we used to see when we'd go out and drive that we remember that there used to be a lot more insects flying around. It's not to say it doesn't happen. I still fly through some insects, here and there. But it's also not about cars being more aerodynamic. It's a real effect. And there's research showing this as well. So there are some longitudinal studies, long-term studies, looking at insect diversity and biomass over time. There was a monitoring project in Ohio looking at butterflies over several decades that found butterflies are 33% less abundant now than they were in the late 1970s. There were studies in Germany done at over 60 sites that have found significant reductions in insect biomass over time. There was a follow-up study in Puerto Rico in the forest that found a 10-fold reduction in insect biomass over the course of several decades. So this is something that's happening globally and locally. And even if we don't have perfect data, I think there's always going to be people looking for better data, better analysis, but we know enough to act. So Taylor gave a great introduction to the bees of Vermont. I think I just wanted to, as I start talking about threats and challenges, want to broaden our horizons a little bit to think about the insects that are active at night as well. So we're daytime animals. We tend to focus on the things that are on flowers when we can see them, but there are many insects that are active at night. Over half of invertebrates are night active, and insect activity is actually a third higher at night than it is during the day. So there's lots of stuff happening up at night. Moths in particular, we think bees are diverse. There's 160,000 species of moths around the world. In every place you find flowering plants, you find moths. So they're also very important. And they're actually really important contributors to apples and brambles and other flowers that stay open at night. So this is an emerging area, and I just want us to keep it in the back of our minds as we talk about threats, that these insects face all the same threats that the daytime insects do, and then layer on top of that artificial light at night, like pollution. So just to point out what I had on the bottom here, there's some research done in brambles. So there are more visitors to bramble flowers during the daytime, but more pollen is moved per visit at night. So let's talk about threats. I'm hoping we're going to just kind of go through this as the doom and gloom part and get to the optimism at the end. There's some really major sort of buckets of threats that many different kinds of wildlife are facing at the same time. Habitat loss, pesticides, diseases and pathogens, and climate change being the big buckets I'm going to throw everything into. So bees and other insects might not be facing financial stress like some of us might be, but they do face energetic stress from having to go farther and farther to find flowers. And also those flowers might be contaminated with pesticides, or their homes might be contaminated with pesticides. So let's talk through this. One of the biggest drivers of insect declines is the loss of food and shelter. So that's what habitat is, right? It's the loss of food and shelter. That's from conversion to agriculture, intensive agriculture, conversion to suburban development, residential development, impervious surfaces, parking lots, that kind of thing. And it's also the removal of flowering resources and then the fragmentation of those resources into smaller and smaller patches. So it's hard for bees to find what they need. There was a study done in Michigan in urban areas that found where there is more impervious surface, so you have more concrete and asphalt, there's fewer bumblebees in those areas. So it's harder for them to nest. Over 90% of Vermont's pollinators, bees, live in the ground. So that soil is a really important piece of the puzzle for nesting and habitat for those species. Habitat loss isn't just about the removal of flowering habitat, it's about degradation, so loss of quality. What does high quality habitat look like? It's habitat that's not contaminated with pesticides, that has some key plant species, so native plants that support native insects. And the example that you could think about would be milkweeds, right? If you don't have milkweeds, you don't have monarchs. The same is true for many other insects that depend on key plant species. And then also, for those nocturnal pollinators that I mentioned, the artificial light at night is something that acts like a pollutant, where that habitat is no longer quite as useful for those pollinators if they're not able to navigate through it and reproduce. Another big thing that I think about, which is why I'm probably going to give it a few more slides than the others, is pesticides. So when I use the word pesticides, it's an umbrella term that means insecticides, things that kill insects, but also fungicides and herbicides and other sides. And we know that bees, as they're flying around, are exposed to a really complex blend of pesticides that they're picking up from lots of different places. pesticide exposure can affect all kinds of different functions for these insects. It can affect just their abilities to survive, but also to lay eggs, to reproduce, to build and form nests, to navigate. So exposure to pesticides is a real concern for all different kinds of insects. Among pesticides, insecticides is what we tend to focus on because they are highly toxic in some cases to a broad suite of different kinds of insects. They're also widely used, not just in agriculture, but around our homes and gardens. Residential use is about 25% of total American insecticide use. So it is an important contributor to bees' exposure and other pollinators. Some of these insecticides are quite long-lived in the environment. And one example I'll use is the neonics. That sort of tick all of these boxes. Highly toxic to bees, widely used across many landscapes, long-lived, and then systemic, so they're water soluble. And as they're applied, they can get taken up by plants and expressed in pollen and nectar, where they're then brought back to the hive or to the nest. So this photo is actually from a bee kill that occurred when a neonic was used on linden trees, flowering linden trees, on label at this point. And it killed about 50,000 bumblebees in a Target parking lot in Oregon. So this is why we focused on neonics, but there's other pesticides, other insecticides that also fit many of these same sort of high-risk categories for insects and for bees in particular. Fungicides, another kind of pesticide that are used for plant diseases. And so these are actually the most common pesticides. When you sample honeybee hive materials, these tend to be the most common material found in those hives. Part of that is because fungicides can be applied during bloom in certain crops that honeybees and other bees are visiting. So they're applied during bloom, bees bring them back to their nest, and they're found in the nest. Some of the concern comes because there are certain common fungicides that when a bee is co-exposed with an insecticide, the fungicide interacts in the body to make the insecticide more toxic. So as bees are exposed to this blend in the environment, they're processing them at the same time, and it can make the insecticide more toxic to the bee. So that's part of why we're concerned about fungicides. The other part is that fungicides themselves make it, in some cases, more difficult for that bee to fight off certain diseases or certain gut pathogens. So if a fungicide is taken in, it affects the microbiome of the gut. It makes that bee maybe more vulnerable to certain gut pathogens. So I'm trying to use each one of these to kind of move us along to the next threat. Disease and pathogens are something that we as humans obviously deal with. Bees also deal with their own set of diseases, pathogens, as well as, in the case of honeybees, the varroa mite, which then vectors additional diseases. So commercial honeybees face some unique challenges, in part because at least some of the commercially managed honeybees are brought around the country, trucked around. They get exposed to different things in the course of being trucked around that make it very challenging for them. And the varroa mite is a particular challenge, of course. How many of you are beekeepers? A lot of beekeepers in the room? I thought so. So one of the things that's also a challenge for, obviously beekeepers are dealing with this and they see the impacts, but other native bees also have diseases and pathogens, some of which are shared with honeybees and some of which are shared with other commercially managed bees. So honeybees are not the only managed pollinator. There are commercially managed bumblebees as well. And there's also some shipping and transport of nascent bees. The backyard orchard bee, blue orchard bee, is shipped around the country as well. And so in the course of that movement, you can get transfer of diseases and pathogens among these bees. So this is a challenge for beekeepers, obviously, but it's also a challenge for native pollinators when they're encountering those pathogens that have maybe been brought in from another place. And then the final thing I'll talk about is climate change. I think this one is evident to all of us after last year's flooding, but it's also showing up in lots of different ways that are harder to track and harder to predict. So there's a variety of different kinds of potential impacts. One of the things that we're definitely going to see are these seasonal activity changes. So pollinators might emerge or arrive before or after the plants that they depend on start to flower. Or you might have something like an early spring warm-up followed by a hard freeze where you suddenly have lost your blossoms. So this is one of the things there's already some research showing that monarch butterflies might be seeing this kind of mismatch between when they arrive and when their milkweed is present. We're also seeing shifting ranges of different species, both in the plants and the pollinators. There's bumblebees in Europe and North America that have had significant contraction in range. This species is a fritillary butterfly from southwestern Colorado. It's endemic to high mountainous areas. Species like that have really narrow habitat requirements and can't move any farther are going to really struggle with some of the impacts of climate change. And then finally, there's also changes in availability and quality of plant resources. So there have been some studies looking at what do plants do when they're exposed to higher levels of CO2. And in some cases, the quality of their pollen actually changes. So it changes the composition of what's in the pollen. Pollen can be a protein source, lipid source, and it changes what is actually available for a pollinator. So we don't know how different plants are necessarily going to react to that, but it's one of the things that is concerning about changes in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, is that plants might respond in ways we're not expecting them to. So lots of things to deal with, lots of threats that don't exist in a vacuum. Bees are dealing with them, wildlife is dealing with them all at the same time, just like we are. But one of the things that underlies a lot of the interacting stressors is poor nutrition. So this is why we're going to talk a lot about habitat, and I'm excited Jane's going to talk about habitat, because having poor nutrition, poor availability of floral resources, makes it so much more difficult for a bee to deal with any of these other stressors. If it doesn't have adequate food resources, it's not going to deal as well with pesticide exposure. It's not going to deal as well with pathogen exposure. And so that's really the key to solving this problem. Sorry, some of this text got cut off, but the main issue is we know enough to act. We know that insects and bees are facing a lot of issues, and we need all hands on deck to provide and protect habitat, turn off the lights for nocturnal pollinators, avoid pesticides, especially around habitat, and then to engage our towns and communities and neighbors in pollinator conservation. So you're all here, you are very engaged, so it's really exciting to see such a great coalition come together around pollinators. I've been working on pollinators now for over a decade, and it was always, I feel like Vermont already had what was needed, and then we just needed to actually talk to each other and start talking about pollinators. So I'll just leave with some hopeful optimism here. Sometimes I think, it's easy to get caught up in what feels totally out of our control globally, but habitat is a really key solution that is very tractable. There is emerging research showing that bees that have access to good nutrition are better able and better equipped to deal with the impacts of pesticide exposure, that it helps buffer some of those impacts for them. So the work that you're doing to create diverse native plantings is going to deal at a local level with a lot of these threats to pollinators. It's giving them the basis to provide more food for their babies, to deal with the impacts of pesticide exposure and pathogens. And also, when you plant diverse native plantings, you're more resilient to those impacts of climate change. You have more plants that are able to deal with a drought situation or a flood situation. Or if you have that early spring warm-up where you lose your blossoms, there's another plant that's ready to come in and blossom right after. So diversity is really key to making a resilient space for pollinators. And you're already doing this last piece, which is being engaged, staying engaged, thinking about policy solutions and community solutions. There's so much work that we can be doing as individuals, but also in community with others. So I'll just point you quickly to our website at xerces.org. Tons of free downloadable resources on everything you might imagine about pollinators and other insects. And happy to take questions at the end. Thank you very much.
I'm seeing a bunch of folks that might need seats, and I'm seeing seats. If you have an empty seat next to you, could you just raise your hand? Okay, so if anyone in the back wants a seat, you can come forward and find a seat if if you're happy standing, that's okay with us. Okay. All right, so our last speaker here is here to offer hope about what you can do in your own backyard or what farmers can do to help pollinators. Jane Sorensen is passionate about pollinator habitat enhancement and loves the opportunity to spread the word. She is a full-time farmer and co-owner of Riverberry Farm, an organic fruit and vegetable farm in Fairfax, Vermont, where she grows and sells native plants for pollinators on the farm and through her online nursery, Northeast Pollinator Plants. And I've been a customer of Jane's native plants for years and highly recommend you check it out. My gardens are looking awesome 4 years in now, yeah. So she recently retired from UVM, where she taught landscape design for pollinators and is a retired landscape architect with 14 years of experience. I regret not taking Jane's class when she was still at UVM, but I'm thrilled that she's here today so that we can all learn a little bit about her life's passions, creating pollinator habitat. Jane.
Well, I'm blessed to my and apparently I'm losing my voice a little bit, so, use this. So I'll have to try to not talk through my hands too much. So native pollinator and beneficial insect habitat enhancement on small farms was what I was asked to speak about. How many of you are farmers? Okay, I have one person I'm speaking. Okay, but certainly the concepts can transfer readily to other landscapes, but so I'll try to kind of broaden it out beyond just farms. Also, all of you, if you haven't picked up, I think there's more copies of this handout at the table at the front. I can talk a little bit about how to use that later in the presentation or at question and answer. So let's get right on to it. So I want to give credit to the Heritage Society for everything I know. Amazing, lots of piles of information, so definitely utilize their resources. There's this book that it's about 10 years old now called Farming for Bees or something like that. Native Farming with Native Beneficial Insects is amazing documentation, useful for the home scale as well as the farm one. So most farms create disruption, but they also create opportunity for reconnecting habitat and enhancing habitat, and certainly that's also true on the home landscape. Many of our crops, many of our crops need insect pollination, and Taylor talked a little bit about this. Certainly most of our tree fruit crops are tree nuts, almonds. How many of you don't have a bag of almonds in your house at this point? And almonds have just gotten a part of our diet. Definitely requires pollination. Certainly most of our small fruits, all of our small fruits, and any of the vegetables that contain seeds are actually fruit, but they need pollination services, seed production, cover crops, oil crops, textile products, and then like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants can actually be somewhat wind pollinated, but they're way better, that way better product if you can get an insect pollination on it. So to start with your evaluation of your farm or your home landscape, you want to take a quick overview on what is your setting, what is your landscape setting. And so look at an aerial photograph and judge about a half mile out how much of that land is in natural or semi-natural condition. And so for natural, semi-natural, what we mean by that would be like woodlands, grasslands, wetlands, riparian areas, excuse me, wooded, suburban wooded areas, non-invasive weedy areas. It does not include lawn. Mown lawn is a deterrent for pollinators to fly over, and there's certainly not much habitat there, as well as overgrazed pastures. So this slide got sort of elongated and went into landscape form, but so then if you just take a pencil, make a printout of aerial photo, figure out what the scale of that is, and take a piece of string that's 2,640 feet equivalent long, draw a little radius, and you can do a quick analysis about how much of that landscape is in natural or semi-natural. We're looking for 20% as sort of a minimum goal. And then also look at that landscape and say, how much of that is in threat of change? And probably a fair bit of it might be in a threat of change. So then you want to move onto your farm or your home landscape and say, what do we have for habitat currently on our farm? People say, I need to create some habitat on my landscape. Well, you might already have some stuff going on there. So, paying more closer attention to what you already have going on in your landscape. So look for some natural habitats or areas that have kind of rewild.
they may be serving actually already as a native pollinator or beneficial insect habitat. Recognize that these could be very important for your garden and crop production. And then what percent of the farm is, to identify what percent of your land is actually already in natural habitat. I want to interrupt this message real quickly and say, we're talking so much about our human food crop, and it's the natural environment. Biodiversity would just simply come to a halt. This is the whole biodiversity, evolution, natural succession would stop if we didn't have insect pollination. So it's not just about our food. So anyway, we'll go back on to the food stuff. So evaluating existing habitat. So this is Riverberry Farm. You can see we've got this nice part of our farm. We've got this nice big open field, and you can imagine not a lot of habitation, not a lot of corridor connections. It's just this big open field. But we are, fortunately to be surrounded by a river, forest. We got some wetlands, waterways, etc. So when we move closer into the farm, we look for what habitat do we. So we saw already that around our farm we have a lot of habitat. We certainly have way greater than that 20% surrounding landscape. And a closer look, you're looking at your field edges. Are there any existing hedgerows, road edges? Your driveways, your power line easements, ditches, etc. And then how much habitat is your goal? So within your own personal landscape, a personal goal might be shooting for this big range that NRCS and others have recommended, going anywhere from 4% to 30%. I'd say let's go for a 20% of your landscape you're looking to have as some kind of habitat. And then how far away should that habitat be a maximum from, if you're doing a crop, that you want to be encouraging some pollination services? Well, our bees have all kinds of different ranges. There's bees are all different sizes, as Taylor showed us in that one slide, from that huge carpenter bee to the little tiny perdita bee that was sitting on its head. So the mason bees, they can fly, up to 300 feet. Honeybees can go up to 2 miles. Bumblebees up to 8 miles. But do we want them to have to go that far? No, let's be a little bit more efficient for them. I've seen lots of different recommendations. From 200 feet to 500 feet is the maximum distance you would like to have your alternate foraging to attracting the pollinators, to accommodating them to your actual crop. Let's go with 300 feet as sort of a nice distance. So here's Riverberry Farm looking at 300-foot radiuses on that field we were showing. So we draw 300-foot radiuses. It's like, well, okay, in this area here, we've got a little bit of stuff going on here, a little bit of stuff going on here, but man, through this center, we're asking these pollinators to go a long way when we've got some crop in here that needs pollination services. We've got this nice river corridor here, we've got a nice woodland wetland here, and woodland over here. So some of the areas are just fine, but in this area here, we definitely need to create some corridors, some pathways, some ways to help get pollinators into our site. So in general, so what you want to be planting in these areas that you're doing some enhancement, you want to make sure you're providing constant and overlapping flowering and having a variety of flower shapes and colors and sizes to accommodate and to attract a diversity of pollinators and beneficial insects. And for a specialty crop, such as a blueberry operation or apple farm, you want to be looking more specifically what are the insects that are really important as beneficial insects, as predators as well as pollinators that we want to be attracting. There is some talk about trying to not compete with your crop, but honestly, we do strawberries in a big way. It's like, I don't know, when they're in bloom, I don't think we're going to compete. I don't worry about the competition so much. So here's a really nice slide from Ohio NRCS showing some of the potential habitat enhancement opportunities on a farm. And so we'll go through real quickly, like a slide or two on each one of these. Bee pastures, field borders, woodland edges, hedgerows. We'll go through each one individually real quickly. So bee pastures are generally sort of a larger patch. So in that, on our farm, where we showed that large area, it might be a good idea to have a larger area somewhere in that center, or maybe a larger strip that can attract a greater diversity and lots of nesting sites. And so different estimates, this is from NRCS Tennessee Pollinator Habitat job sheet, giving all kinds of little statistics on how big or how much 5 acre, or half an acre, they're saying is sort of a minimum. You can be using perennials primarily, so native wildflowers is really what we're looking for mostly, as well as some native grasses. Thank you. And then maybe up to 20% woody shrubs and vines. Another opportunity is your field borders, so this is kind of like along the length of the fields. This would be a quick no-brainer for the farmers if you don't want to put it on the end where the tractor's going to roll across or where your field access. You will learn that pretty quickly that you don't want to put those things there, otherwise you don't have them anymore. So the length of the, parallel to the where you work it. Again, that should be mostly perennials with some grasses, maybe some shrubs, but primarily we're talking about using wildflowers. And then woodland habitat edges, the woodland edges. So when we started farming, I'm a child of a farmer. My dad grew up on the farm, and he didn't take over the farm. His brother took over the farm. And my dad would often talk about, it's like, yeah, if I took over that farm, I'd do a better job of keeping all those edges cleaned. And he was definitely, that farm attitude was mow, no weeds, no nothing anywhere. And so I was raised with that attitude. When we started farming, we were mowing, we were keeping our farm looking so pretty. It's like, ooh, he's died now, and he would be so embarrassed by my farm. It's a weedy mess, and we love it. So, anyway. So farmers historically mowed extensively all around the edges, and so the idea is that step back and let those weeds, let those areas rewild as much as possible. And then, of course, as we're warming, we're getting more and more invasive species, so it's important for us to pay attention to what weeds are growing in there and take care of those invasive species. Well, so something happened with my text. It was definitely not this big. Anyway, I can barely read that. It's getting smaller as the presentation goes. Something's happening here. Anyway, so hedgerows can serve lots of functions. You can all read that, right? So they can serve as pollinator habitat. They can serve as wind and snow blow, snow resistant, snow, what do I want? Thank you. Reduce soil erosion. They can serve as wildlife corridors, movement of animals. If you're using it around a livestock area, it can be serving as a livestock brow. It can also be a crop itself, coppicing or getting fence materials, etc. Sometimes it's bigger. So in a fragmented landscape such as a farmland, hedgerows can, again, provide those corridors. And if you're trying to do it as sort of erosion control or something, be paying attention to your contours. And then certainly, obviously, any kind of steep slopes. Anybody who is a farmer have access to, there's all kinds of funds. NRCS is just an incredibly well-endowed government agency. There's so much money available for farmers. And so a lot of the stuff, a lot of the money that you can use toward doing projects on your property has not always included pollinator habitat, but all of the things, all of the stuff that you can do can also be pollinator habitat. So, steep slope erosion, well, they used to plant that with grasses that became invasive or stuff. Anyway, so now we can transplant that into more like native grasses and native wildflowers. Same with filter strips, trying to cleanse the water as it runs, at the runoff that runs down to your waterways. Same thing with the riparian edges. So that slide, I won't look back up that slide. That first slide I showed of our farm, that was shortly after we bought it, and there was hardly any woodland along the river edge. There's a big power line utility that goes through there, on the road edges and stuff. So we have stepped back from everywhere, and we have much, much more just rewilding of the farm than from when we first bought it, especially along the river edge. Wetlands. You need to make sure that your wetland, if you do have a wetland on your property, that it's not a mapped wetland that has restrictions on it, that you need to get permission from the feds or the state, whatever level it's protected on. But wetlands are an opportunity where you can expand your diversity. plant foraging. And then annual crops, this is certainly true in your gardens as well as a farm, any land that's left fallow. You pulled out your lettuce, you're done planting in that area, you can plant a cover crop in there. And so those cover crops, if you can mix a couple different types of cover crops in there, things like yellow sweet clover. Oh my gosh, when we plant yellow sweet clover on the farm and you walk anywhere near it, it's deafening. The bees, it's like, it's so freaking loud. Phacelia, buckwheat, partridge peas. We use a lot of hairy vetch and rye as a cover crop, and the vetch is very attractive too. I've seen a lot of bumblebees. So those are the annual cover crops, but then if you have a permanent crop like an orchard or berries, you might want to use a permanent cover crop, and I would generally recommend maybe a mix of different clovers, like a white clover, red clover, and all-site clover. One disadvantage we do grow is raspberries, and one disadvantage of a perennial cover crop is that we found that the Japanese beetles, which is definitely a pest of raspberries, they overwinter in the ground, and so if you're tilling it, you help disturb that. So we've stopped a permanent cover between our raspberry rows. Insectary strips, this is something you can certainly do in the garden scale also. Insectary strips are annuals that you plant within your garden. You know, you take, like Rodale has said, every 8 rows. Other statistics say less frequently is necessary. But just plant this row of annual flowers that come quick to bloom and stay bloom all summer, and they really can be attracting lots of different beneficial insects and pollinators to travel through your landscape. Make sure you're not going to be spraying this field if you have this insectary strip where you've attracted all these pollinators. Like, we gotcha. Bad combination. So this book has, on page 89, has a really great list of what plants you would include in those insectary strips. But basically, there's a lot of our herbs, if you allow them to go to flower, are really beneficial, like coriander, dill. Sorry, I'm really big on the scientific names, and I'm very bad with common names. So let's see if I can translate these up. Cornflower, gaillardia, alyssum, lemon balm, and some sunflowers are what those plants are included. Beetle banks are a really cool idea. Anybody raise a hand have heard of beetle banks? Not many folks, just a few of our more learned folks here. It's an idea that's been used in the UK quite a bit, and it's starting to catch up a little bit in the US. I heard Charlie Nardozzi talk about beetle banks on one of his last conversations. Anyway, it's just a grazed grass, native grass planted berm that you put through your garden or through the farm field. And native grasses are really good at attracting beetles who eat everything. Insects-wise, including your beneficials. So anyway, to create one, you can just plow in one direction, come back, plow in the other, so you've made a little hillock, and plant it with native grasses, mow it a couple times a year, or once or twice for the first couple years, and then you just let it take over, and you'll attract these beetles that will then travel through your garden or through your field and head out into the field and be a great natural insecticide for you. And then also don't forget the farmstead itself can serve as your part of your pollinator habitat. Again, I'm talking about a specialized farm. You might want to research who are the best pollinators for your crop, the range of their flowering time, identifying the foraging plants that would be attractive to those plants. This book has an excellent pile of, in the back, list of beneficial insects and the plants that they'd be attracted to, and where those habitats could be on the farm. And then create a pollinator plant list for your specialized crop. Oh my God. Those are like really big on my lawn. Anyway, so those of you that have a handout, the last page has a summary of all those, what I just talked about, that half acre right on the farm, and then these lists of opportunities within your farm, and certainly a lot of these can be also true on your own home landscape. So you're from a formal garden to a naturalized garden, to a meadow, to an unmowed wooded edge, along your driveway, ditches, all those things on your home landscape also. So in general, the plant palette should provide constant overlapping flowering. So those of you that have this, you can take a look at these sheets here. So I created these sheets back when I was teaching, and then found it's a really useful tool, certainly beyond my students who had no land or weren't gardening much. So this is a much more useful audience. So you want to provide constant overlapping flowering, and so you can see the flowering time, approximate schedule, and trying to make sure you're selecting plants that are giving you that constant overlapping flowering. The first sheet are with the green banner are the wildflowers that tend to be a little bit more well-behaved, so maybe a little bit more garden-oriented. And then the next sheet is yellow, which are ones that are a little bit more short-lived and reseed with abundance or rambunctious root systems. So those who wouldn't put in such a garden situation, but more in a sort of meadow situation. And then it goes into trees and shrubs and vines. At the tree page, you can see the trees are really excellent in providing that early flowering, so it's a great way to extend your flowering foraging. And generally, this came from Xerces, thank you very much. Provide 3 foraging species that bloom at a time as a minimum, so 3 early, 3 mid-season, 3 late, and then include at least 1 native bunch grass. That's 10 species. And they also found some research showing that, you can keep adding species, but at some point, maybe once you get past 20 flower species, you might see a dropping off of the pollinators that are attractive, so you don't have to go bonkers. So many other side lectures, but I won't talk about it. So native trees and shrubs can really help extend that. And then if you have some natural areas, but you're really not quite sure how beneficial they are, spend a week, once a week, take a little walk by it and say, what's flowering? And you don't even have to identify what is flowering, just make a little note. During the first week in June, not much is flowering. It's like, I've got a little window here or there. I should maybe fill in some of these blocks. And what color was flowering that time? It's like, you don't have to get too scientific about it. You can just say, all right, I need to add a little bit more blue or pink or yellow or whatever, and ideally native plants. So here's our farm pollinator habitat enhancement, and so I've been working, I have access to a lot of plants. So this is very fun. So at the end of the season, I keep adding in to our bee pasture here, and then field borders all around, and then this is sort of, we are in the riparian zone, we've expanded in the wetlands, and then along the road, we've taken a good 25-30 feet that we've stopped the farming right up to the edge and letting that rewild. I haven't started filling in on that, but that will be a next criteria. We planted red maples along the road, and now I'm just letting it rewild underneath. And here's a really great little from a farm brochure from the Xerces Society. So thank you very much. Jane Sorensen, Riverberry Farm. It's strawberry season. Just a quick little advertisement.
All right, so if we could get those 3 speakers up here, we're gonna just have time for maybe let's do like 3 questions, 1 for each of you guys, because we're running a little over time, but that's okay. And I'll hand you this microphone. Yep, we'll do that.
You've got a question in the back?
Yeah, so it was great to be a student of yours, Jane. Thank you so much for applying it to many places. And question I have for all of you is involving health.
Did you hear the first part? Yeah. Yep. Thanks so much for your great work. Question I have for you all is about certain non-native species that host a ton of pollinators, like buckthorn, honeysuckle. Yeah, just curious your perspective on that conundrum.
Yeah, so invasive species, many of our invasive species are incredibly beneficial, which is really frustrating when you're trying to say, like, you may want to keep those beneficial, those invasive species in check. The problem is the invasiveness. So as that invasive plant becomes predominant and dominant, who they satisfy, who they attract, is the extent of the diversity you're attracting. So, is it not on? Okay. Anyway, So that would be my quick takeaway. There's also a really amazing book called The Rambunctious Garden that's about invasive species. It's about research on invasive species, and I can't remember the name of the author. Emma something. Anyway, it's a fascinating book, and I take it with a grain of salt. But basically, the research is showing that in many cases, the invasive species hit this huge, like whoa, so crazy, and then after time, they settle down into finding their niche and become another beneficial organism. So I take it with a grain of salt on how much I want to combat invasive species. The problem is it's often within your lifespan. So like purple blue stripe was an incredibly invasive plant, and now in an area that I've been watching for 25 years, I barely see it anymore. It's interesting.
I think you've answered that well. I try and keep in non-native species to be 20% or less of what I have in my property. So where honeysuckle, where buckthorn are taking over, finding ways to increase that diversity instead. So sometimes it's about management of those species where they've taken over and are the only thing present to accommodate more of the native diversity.
That was good.
My question is talking about cultivars and avatars that are being marketed today in place of the true native species. And is that our next big challenge?
No. Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it's been our challenge. Our landscape is already entirely full of primarily nativars, cultivars of native plants. Any of you have heard of Annie White? She's a professor at UVM now, or assistant, position is. Anyway, she teaches there, and she's taken over a lot of courses that I used to teach while she was also my teaching assistant. Lucky me. Anyway, and while she was working on her doctorate research was exactly that question on what is the comparative advantage of nativars, disadvantage of nativars, cultivars of native plants versus attractiveness versus the true native. And she used 14 species of native plants and then found the most commonly sold cultivar of those, and then compared the attractiveness over periods of months. And her research results would basically resulted in saying, in general, the native pollinators would prefer you stuck with the true native native plant, not the cultivar. So in general, that's what I only grow and sell the true natives. But there were, of course, some exceptions. But the exceptions were not necessarily an argument for, like, we should definitely be growing that cultivar. There are, like, when you go to a garden center, it drives me bonkers, and they have advertised, native plants, and they're all cultivars. Well, sure, but don't throw up your hands. It's like, if you can't get your hand on the true native, they will still do some attraction, but probably not as much as the true native. Definitely avoid less red flowers, because bees can't see that end of the spectrum unless it has a lot of odor, but especially double flowers, because the sex parts have been turned into to look like petals, and way less pollen and nectar, if any, production. But if you can get the true natives, go for it.
Nothing. That was awesome.
One more question? Is there one more? No?
I have a second question on that. Test. Coreopsis lanceonata. There's a moonbeam coreopsis, and I was talking to, I can't remember his name now, but it doesn't have an ounce of nectar in it.
No, right.
And
Case in point.
well, I'm just wondering, maybe we need more research on that, just so people aren't misled and stuff at the garden centers and stuff.
Yeah, it's not necessarily research. Definitely, there is, like, Proof of Winners is coming out with a line. Maybe it's not Proof of Winners, sorry, my words here, but there are some plant organizations that are trying to develop, doing more hybridization and saying that, we're going to try to create hybrids, cultivars that are truly, as attractive. The problem is like, for what you test in that particular location. We know squat. We know squat. I mean, sorry, you researchers, but we know squat. We know about, in that particular area, the existing pollinators that were there who were attracted to that particular plant and or that cultivar. And, these insects know what they're attracted to. They don't need us to monkey around with it. If we're creating habitat, it's not about our preferences. We need to change our aesthetic. Have a bee mind, look like a bee. If you're creating habitat, it's not about like what looks pretty to you. And if you have a problem with what it looks like, put up a sign, pollinator habitat. All of a sudden you went from being a mess to being kind of cool.
Yeah, please.
I just want to add 2 quick things, because what you just said at the end, like the messy thing, your story about good farmers are clean farmers, good farmers don't see weeds. So I have a lot of farmers in my family too, and that is definitely the ethic. And if there were one sort of cultural norm that I'd want to change, it's that a good farmer is a farmer that has like clean, whatever you call it, margins and inner rows and things. I would love for the sort of messiness and the beauty of messiness to take over instead. And so if anybody has any ideas about that, that seems like a public relations or cultural change campaign that is going to make everything we do harder or easier. I would love there to be like a Life is Messy campaign or something. So that's that thing. And then just a reminder that there are bees up here to take a look at. So once we break up, if you're interested in bees, I'll stick around and talk you through some bees. Maybe Leslie can too, Spencer can too, some other people who know bees.
I suggest they go to the Grow Wild table, and if you want to come see the bees.
Yes, even better. There's a Grow Wild table out among the tents, and that's where these bees will wind up. So come there and we'll do what I just said.